Everything changed in a matter of seconds, and almost nobody caught it the first time. There was no dramatic announcement, no headline quote, no moment where someone stepped up and clearly declared a new direction for the Cleveland Browns. On the surface, it looked like every other press conference we've seen 100 times before. Safe answers, familiar names, nothing that would immediately set off alarms. But if you slowed it down, if you really listened instead of just hearing it, there was something different in the air. The tone wasn't random, the structure wasn't accidental, and the way certain names were delivered carried a weight that went far beyond the words themselves. Because this wasn't just about what was said, it was about how it was said, and more importantly, what it quietly revealed. One name came with energy, intention, and a clear sense of future attached to it, like it actually meant something in the long-term vision of the team. Another name, in contrast, felt like it was simply added on at the end, mentioned because it had to be, not because it mattered in the same way. There was no real emphasis, no forward-looking language, no signal that this player was part of what comes next. And that contrast, subtle as it may seem at first, told the entire story for anyone paying close enough attention. For months, the situation in Cleveland has been framed as a competition, a battle that was still ongoing, a question waiting to be answered. Fans were told that multiple quarterbacks were on equal ground, that development was the priority, that decisions were being made based on performance and readiness. But in that one moment, standing at that podium, without directly saying it, that entire narrative began to collapse. The illusion of a balanced competition started to fade, replaced by something much more concrete and much more revealing, a clear hierarchy that had already been decided behind the scenes. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. What looked like a routine press conference suddenly becomes something else entirely, a turning point, a quiet confirmation of everything that had been building for months. Because this wasn't a sudden shift or a last-minute decision. This was the result of a long process finally showing itself in public, in the smallest details that most people overlook. And what it exposed wasn't just a change in direction, it was the truth about what this situation has really been all along. The moment it really started to click came at the podium, when Todd Monken stepped up and began doing exactly what new head coaches always do, talking about the pieces he's excited to work with. On the surface, it sounded completely normal. He mentioned playmakers, highlighted talent, and walked through the roster in a way that felt routine. But if you paid attention to the sequence, the specific wording, and the energy behind each name, a very clear picture started to form. He didn't just list players randomly, he built a hierarchy, whether intentionally or not, and that hierarchy spoke louder than anything else he could have said directly. He started with players like Harold Fannin Jr. and Jerry Jeudy, giving them clear, intentional mentions. Then, when he got to Shedeur Sanders, there was a noticeable shift. The tone sharpened, the language became more forward-looking. There was actual excitement in how he described him, not just as a player on the roster, but as someone who could actively shape what this team becomes moving forward. It didn't feel like filler, it felt like focus, like this was someone already being viewed through the lens of opportunity, not just evaluation. And then came the contrast that made everything stand out. After discussing Deshaun Watson and referencing what he's been at his peak, Monken finally mentioned Dillon Gabriel, and it felt completely different. No build-up, no added emphasis, no sense of projection into the future, just a quick acknowledgement, almost like a name that needed to be included before moving on. It didn't carry the same weight, and more importantly, it didn't carry the same intent. It sounded less like a competitor in a quarterback battle and more like a player being accounted for on a depth chart. That difference isn't something that happens by accident, especially not in a setting where every word is carefully chosen. Coaches understand how their comments are interpreted. They know how fans, media, and even players themselves read into tone and structure. So when one name is delivered with clarity and energy, and another is mentioned almost as an afterthought, it tells you exactly where things stand, even if nobody is willing to say it outright. And that's the part that makes this moment so important, because while nothing was officially announced, the message was already out there for anyone willing to look closely enough. The roles, the priorities, the direction of the quarterback room, it was all sitting right there in plain sight.
But what made it even more undeniable was how quickly the outside world picked up on it. It didn't take long for the outside world to catch on, and when it didn't come in the form of opinions or hot takes. It came through numbers, real numbers, backed by real money. Because while fans were still debating what that press conference meant, prediction markets had already started adjusting, and the shift was impossible to ignore. Platforms that track these probabilities in real time began reflecting exactly what that podium moment hinted at, and they did it without hesitation. Shedeur Sanders suddenly found himself at the top of the board, sitting at roughly a 44% chance to be the Browns' Week 1 starter. Right behind him was Deshaun Watson, hovering in the mid-30s, a player who hasn't taken a meaningful NFL snap in over a year and is still coming off repeated injury setbacks. And then there was Dillon Gabriel, sitting all the way down at around 12%. 12, not just behind Sanders, but significantly behind a quarterback whose availability is still a question mark. That's not a tight race, that's not uncertainty, that's separation. And this is where it gets important, because prediction markets don't operate on narratives, they operate on belief backed by risk. People are literally putting money on what they think is going to happen, often based on information, patterns, and signals that casual observers might miss. So when those numbers shift this aggressively, it's not random, it's a reaction. A reaction to tone, to direction, to everything that was quietly communicated without being officially confirmed.
What makes it even more telling is how far Gabriel has fallen in that conversation. This is the same quarterback who was once positioned as a priority, the same player who was given early opportunities, who was framed as system-ready and ahead in development. And now, in a matter of weeks under a new regime, he's not even being treated like a serious contender by the people betting on the outcome. That kind of drop doesn't happen unless the signal coming from inside the organization is crystal clear. At that point, it stops looking like a competition and starts looking like a conclusion that just hasn't been publicly announced yet. The press conference hinted at it, but the odds confirmed it. And once those two things line up, what's being said and what people actually believe, it becomes very hard to argue that this is still an open race. But to really understand how it got to this point, you have to go back to where it all started. To understand why this moment feels so inevitable now, you have to go all the way back to draft night, because that's where the foundation for this entire situation was quietly built. At the time, the Cleveland Browns were in a position that almost every struggling team eventually finds itself in. They needed a quarterback, badly. The Deshaun Watson situation had already spiraled into one of the most expensive and complicated problems in the league, and there was no clear long-term answer on the roster. Holding a top pick, they had a real opportunity to reset the position completely and bring in a true franchise centerpiece. But instead of making that clean, decisive move, they went in a different direction. They traded around the board, passed on taking a quarterback at the very top, and waited until the middle rounds to address the most important position in football. That decision alone raised eyebrows, but what really changed everything was the order in which they made their picks. With the 94th overall selection in the 3rd round, they chose Dillon Gabriel. Then, later in the 5th round, with the 144th pick, they selected Shedeur Sanders. That order wasn't just a technical detail, it sent a message. Because in the NFL, draft position isn't just about talent evaluation, it's about priority, investment, and belief. Taking Gabriel earlier immediately framed him as the preferred option, the player the coaching staff felt more comfortable building around, especially within the structure of their existing system. And according to multiple reports at the time, that decision wasn't made in a vacuum. It's been said that then head coach Kevin Stefanski had a strong influence on pushing for Gabriel, favoring his fit in a timing-based offense over Sanders' more dynamic, high-upside profile. So from the very beginning, the narrative was shaped before either player even stepped onto the field. Gabriel was labeled as the ready option, the one who fit the system, the safer choice. Sanders, on the other hand, was viewed as the project, the developmental player, the one who needed time. And once those labels are assigned, they tend to stick, especially inside an organization that's trying to justify its own decisions. But here's the part that makes this so important in hindsight. That initial preference didn't just influence how they were drafted, it dictated how they were treated moving forward. It set the depth chart, shaped the opportunities, and ultimately determined who got the first real chance to prove themselves. And once that kind of momentum starts, it's incredibly difficult to reverse, even when the results start telling a different story. And that's exactly where things began to unravel. Once the season actually started, that draft night decision didn't stay in the background. It showed up immediately in how the team operated. The depth chart made it clear from day one that Dillon Gabriel was ahead, while Shedeur Sanders was pushed further down the line. There was no gradual competition, no real back-and-forth battle in the early stages. The structure had already been decided, and everything that followed seemed to reinforce it. Cleveland opened the season with a veteran presence under center, leaning on experience to stabilize things. But when that plan shifted mid-season, the opportunity didn't go to Sanders. It went straight to Gabriel, exactly in line with how things had been set up months earlier. And at first glance, you could almost understand the logic. Gabriel was seen as the safer option, the one who could operate within the system, make the routine throws, and avoid major mistakes. But once he actually got on the field, the gap between safe and effective started to become very clear. On paper, some of his numbers didn't look terrible. Touchdowns compared to interceptions, completion percentage hovering near average, but those surface stats didn't tell the real story. Because when you looked deeper, when you actually broke down how the offense was functioning, the limitations were impossible to ignore. The most glaring number was the yards per attempt, sitting at just 5.1. That's not just low, it's a signal. It tells you the offense isn't stretching the field, isn't creating explosive plays, isn't forcing defenses to respect anything beyond short, controlled throws. It's the kind of production that can keep things afloat for a while, but it rarely wins games, especially in a league built on big plays and offensive pressure. And that's exactly what started happening. Drives stalled, scoring opportunities disappeared, the offense became predictable, and opposing defenses adjusted quickly. Meanwhile, the situation around him only made things look worse. The season was moved, and almost immediately began producing elsewhere, which only amplified the questions about how things were being handled in Cleveland. It created a comparison that fans couldn't ignore. Why did things suddenly look more functional outside the system than inside it? And once that question starts circulating, it's hard to contain. But even with all of that, even with the lack of explosiveness, the struggles to move the ball consistently, and the growing frustration from the outside, the structure didn't change. Gabriel kept getting opportunities, kept being positioned as the primary option, while Sanders remained on the outside looking in. And that's when the conversation shifted from simple development to something that didn't sit right with a lot of people watching closely. Because at a certain point, it wasn't just about performance anymore. It was about why the performance wasn't leading to a different decision. The turning point didn't come from a bold coaching decision or a carefully planned transition. It came from something no one could control. After weeks of watching the offense stall and the same patterns repeat, the change everyone had been asking about finally happened, but not by choice. It took a concussion, an unavoidable moment, to force the door open. And just like that, the opportunity that had been delayed all season landed in Shedeur Sanders' hands. That detail matters more than anything because it completely changes how you view what happened next. This wasn't a coach deciding it was time to see what his other quarterback could do. This wasn't a strategic shift based on performance trends. This was a situation where there was no other option left. Sanders wasn't gradually worked into the system. He was dropped into it, suddenly, without the runway that had been given to Gabriel. And yet, from the moment he stepped on the field, something felt different. The offense had a different rhythm, a different energy. The ball started moving with more intent. There was a willingness to push it downfield, to test defenses, to create plays instead of just managing them. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive in a way that it hadn't been before, and that contrast didn't go unnoticed.
Fans saw it immediately. Analysts started pointing it out. The same questions that had been quietly building all season suddenly became impossible to ignore. If this was there all along, why did it take so long to see it? And that's where things took an even more uncomfortable turn. Because when the moment passed and the questions were asked directly, when reporters pressed on whether it had been a mistake to wait this long, the response wasn't a defense, wasn't an explanation, wasn't even an attempt to justify the process. It was a refusal. A simple shutdown, no real answer, no clarity, just a line drawn to avoid going deeper. And sometimes, that kind of silence says more than any explanation ever could. Because when a decision is truly believed in, it gets defended, it gets explained, it gets backed up with reasoning. But when the response is to step away from the question entirely, it leaves a gap, and people are naturally going to try to fill that gap with their own conclusions. That moment didn't just introduce Sanders to the field, it introduced doubt into everything that had happened before it. And once that doubt was there, it didn't go away. And just when it felt like the situation couldn't get any more confusing, everything took another turn after the season ended. Kevin Stefanski was out, fired after years of inconsistency, a losing record, and back-to-back seasons where the offense ranked near the bottom of the league. On paper, it looked like a clean break, a reset for the organization, a chance to move in a different direction. But what happened next didn't bring clarity. If anything, it made the entire situation even harder to make sense of. Because once Stefanski was no longer in the building, no longer responsible for the decisions being made on the field, his tone completely shifted. He started appearing on shows, doing interviews, and talking openly about the very quarterback he had kept on the sidelines for most of the season. And what he said caught a lot of people off guard. He praised Shedeur Sanders, talked about his mindset, his preparation, the way he was wired for the game, spoke highly of his development, and even pointed to how he performed late in the season as something worth building on. And that's where the disconnect became impossible to ignore, because if that's how he truly felt, if he believed Sanders had the right makeup, the right approach, the right potential, then why didn't that belief show up when it actually mattered? Why didn't it translate to earlier opportunities, into meaningful reps, into a real chance to lead before the situation forced his hand? It's one thing to recognize talent after the fact, it's another to act on it in real time. The contrast between those words and his actions during the season created a gap that fans couldn't reconcile. It's not that people expect every decision to be perfect, far from it, but they do expect consistency. They expect alignment between what a coach says and what a coach does. And in this case, those two things felt like they were moving in completely different directions. Now, to be fair, there are always layers to these situations that don't fully surface publicly. Coaching decisions are influenced by system preferences, internal evaluations, long-term planning, and pressure from all sides. It's rarely as simple as choosing one player over another. But even with all of that context, the shift in tone after the fact raised more questions than it answered. Because it didn't sound like someone who doubted Sanders, it sounded like someone who believed in him, just not enough to show it when it counted. And once those contradictions were out in the open, the conversation started to move beyond just one coach or one decision. It started to point to something bigger, something structural in how this entire situation had been presented from the beginning. And that's where the conversation starts to widen, because at some point, it stopped being just about coaching decisions and started being about how those decisions were being explained to everyone on the outside. The narrative that surrounded this quarterback situation all season didn't come from nowhere. It was shaped, reinforced, and repeated through the same channels over and over again until it started to feel like fact. And that's where the real issue begins, because when the people delivering the information are closely tied to the people making the decisions, the line between reporting and framing gets blurry. In Cleveland, a large portion of that media ecosystem was built on access to the head coach, access to internal thinking, access to just enough information to feel like you're getting the real story. But that access comes with a trade-off, whether it's intentional or not. When your primary source is the same person whose decisions are being questioned, you're naturally going to reflect their perspective. You're going to echo the reasoning, repeat the justifications, and present the situation in a way that aligns with how it's being explained to you behind the scenes.
And that's exactly what played out. The early narrative leaned heavily toward Dillon Gabriel being the more ready option, the better fit for the system, the safer choice to manage the offense. At the same time, Shedeur Sanders was framed as someone who needed time, someone who wasn't quite there yet, someone whose development required patience. Those ideas didn't just appear, they were fed, circulated, and reinforced until they became the dominant storyline. But the problem with that kind of narrative is that it only holds up as long as the results support it. And once the results started going in the opposite direction, once the offense struggled, once the lack of explosiveness became obvious, once Sanders finally got on the field and showed a different level of energy, that entire framework started to crack. Suddenly, the explanations didn't feel as solid. The confidence behind them started to fade. This isn't about calling it a conspiracy or suggesting there was some coordinated effort to mislead people. It's more subtle than that. It's about how systems protect themselves, how information flows in one direction, gets interpreted through a certain lens, and then gets presented back to the public as the most reasonable version of events. And when that cycle repeats long enough, it becomes difficult to step outside of it and question whether the original premise was ever right to begin with. But once the leadership changed, once a new voice stepped in without those same connections or obligations, the tone shifted almost instantly. And that's when people started to realize just how much of the previous narrative may have been shaped rather than discovered. And right when that realization was starting to settle in, another voice entered the conversation that made everything even clearer. And right when the conversation was starting to feel like it might spiral into endless opinions and debates, someone stepped in with a completely different approach. No narratives, no inside sources, just film. Kurt Warner, a Hall of Fame quarterback who's built a reputation on breaking the game down to its core, took a step back from the noise and did something simple but powerful. He watched the tape. Not highlights, not social media clips, not the curated moments people like to push, but the actual, full context of what was happening on the field. When he looked at Malik Willis, a name that had been gaining traction as a possible option in quarterback discussions, his conclusion wasn't emotional or dramatic. It was measured, almost blunt. After stripping away the easy throws, the screens, the quick plays designed to inflate perception, and the scrambles that don't reflect structured quarterbacking, he found there were only around 28 meaningful dropbacks to evaluate over a multi-season stretch. 28! For a player some were talking about as a serious solution, that number alone changed the entire conversation. And the point wasn't that Willis couldn't play. Warner didn't come out and dismiss him outright. What he highlighted was something more important, the gap between perception and evidence. The hype surrounding a player can grow quickly, especially when it's fueled by limited flashes or selective moments. But when you reduce everything down to actual, repeatable, on-field data, sometimes that hype doesn't hold up the way people expect it to. That same principle applies directly to what happened in Cleveland, because for months the discussion around the quarterback situation was driven by labels, assumptions, and controlled narratives about who was ready and who wasn't. But once you shift the focus to what actually happened on the field, the production, the impact, the way the offense functioned under each player, the story starts to look very different. It becomes less about what was said and more about what can be proven. And that's the reality check. Film doesn't care about draft position. It doesn't care about system preferences or internal narratives. It shows what's there and what isn't without bias. And when you apply that same lens to the Browns situation, it becomes a lot harder to justify how things were handled earlier in the season. Because at that point, you're no longer debating opinions, you're looking at evidence. And once that shift happens, it doesn't just change how you view the past, it changes what you expect moving forward. And now, with a new regime in place, everything feels different, and more importantly, it looks different. The uncertainty that once surrounded this quarterback room is starting to fade, replaced by something much clearer. Not because there's been a dramatic announcement or a headline decision, but because of the way the organization is now presenting itself. The tone has shifted. The messaging is changed, and for the first time, it feels like the direction is being aligned with what people have been seeing on the field all along.
Shedeur Sanders is no longer being talked about as a developmental piece or a long-term project. The language around him has evolved into something much more immediate, much more intentional. There's an emphasis on what he can do now, not just what he might become later. The excitement in how he's being discussed isn't subtle anymore. It's direct, it's forward-looking, and it carries the kind of weight you only hear when a player is being seriously considered as a central part of the team's identity. At the same time, the contrast with the past is impossible to ignore. Under the previous structure, everything felt delayed, hesitant, almost like the organization was trying to fit players into a predetermined system instead of adapting to what was actually working. Now it feels like that approach is being flipped. Instead of forcing a narrative, the new leadership is responding to reality, leaning into the player who has shown the ability to create, to push the offense, to bring something different to the table. And that's why this doesn't feel like a sudden rise or an unexpected breakthrough. It feels like a correction, like something that should have happened earlier, finally being allowed to take shape. The signs were there, the flashes were there, the production, when given the opportunity, was there. The only thing missing was the willingness to fully commit to it. Now that hesitation seems to be gone. The messaging is clearer, the priorities are more visible, and while nothing has been officially locked in yet, the direction is becoming harder and harder to deny. Because when a new coach walks in and immediately changes the tone around a specific player, it's not random, it's intentional. And if this really is the start of a new era in Cleveland, then it's becoming increasingly obvious who's standing at the center of this. And when you step back and look at everything together, the draft decisions, the way the season unfolded, the forced opportunity, the post-season contradictions, the media narrative, and now the shift in tone under a new coach, it leads to one conclusion that's hard to avoid. This was never really a competition. It was presented that way, it was talked about that way, it was framed as a slow, patient process where multiple players were being evaluated equally, but the reality underneath was very different. From the moment those draft picks were made, a direction was chosen. From the moment the depth chart was set, a preference was established, and even when the results started to challenge that preference, the structure didn't change until it absolutely had to. What we're seeing now isn't a sudden breakout or a surprise development. It's not a case of one player randomly pulling ahead at the last second. It's the removal of everything that was holding the situation in place before. A new voice comes in, looks at the same roster without the same attachments, and almost immediately the picture becomes clearer. The hesitation disappears, the messaging sharpens, and the player who once had to wait for an opportunity is now being discussed like the future. That doesn't happen by accident. Because the truth is, Shedeur Sanders didn't just suddenly become this player overnight. The traits were always there. The flashes were always there. The difference now is that those things are finally being acknowledged in a way that matches what's actually happening on the field. The gap between perception and reality is starting to close. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. Not just who ends up starting or how the depth chart looks when the season begins, but how easily narratives can shape what people believe they're seeing, even when the evidence is pointing somewhere else the entire time. Now, that gap is gone, the direction is visible, and for the first time in a long time, it feels like what's happening behind the scenes is finally lining up with what everyone else can already see.